Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of Clearhead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. ADHD, or Attention Deficit and Hyperactive Disorder, is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by executive dysfunction. Symptoms commonly include being impulsive, having difficulties concentrating, and regulating your emotions. Over the last 20 years, there has been a steady increase in ADHD diagnosis, especially adult ADHD. There are significant consequences to a person's personal and professional life when ADHD is left untreated. But with timely support, especially in the workplace, it can make a world of difference. Today's guest is Darrin Bull. He is the chairperson of ADHD New Zealand, the largest and longest-standing non-profit organization committed to supporting those living with ADHD. They estimated the 280,000 people across the country have ADHD, and of that, 80% of them are undiagnosed. That is why, in their work, they focus on individuals sharing their stories and enabling people to collaborate on solutions in order for everyone living with ADHD to thrive through expert advice and support. Darren also runs the Neurodiverse Support Group for his employer FMG, New Zealand's largest rural insurer, with more than 80 employees participating in this group. Welcome, Darren.
Kia ora. Thank you for having me.
Well, Darren, why don't we start off with what made you decide to get involved in this world?
Yeah, so it was really quite simple. At the age of 5, my son was diagnosed with ADHD and autism, and which is quite the shock. I knew nothing about it. And then from that point onwards, started to fight the system, if that's the right way of saying it. So I joined a support group, and for those of you as parents, I think support groups are really important. And at that stage, we were the Auckland-based parent support group, and in about 2016, I decided to then morph that into ADHD New Zealand, because the experiences we all had as parents and those of ADHD in the workplace was just going to be the same, and it wasn't getting any better. So ADHD New Zealand as a support group has been going for 40 years, but as a representative body for New Zealand's about 6 years.
From a layperson perspective, what is ADHD?
Thank you. First of all, I am a layperson, so do not quote me. I'm no medical expert. But sort of as you talked about at the start of your intro, Angela, it is a neurodevelopmental disorder. Key thing, neurodevelopmental, and it impacts sort of the front part of the brain. The front part of the brain is kind of responsible for filtering, controlling attention, behavior, emotions, your energy, and your judgment. So it's a really key part of the brain. And interestingly, there are 2 types or 3 types of ADHD. There's the predominantly inattentive presentation, which is 90% girls, and often what they find is, if you like, they get a bit daydreaming, get a little bit lost. And then there's also the predominantly hyperactivity and impulsive, which is 90% males. And that's really where the cliche of ADHD is. They're the hyperactive children and adults. They've got a lot of energy. And there's a lot of stereotypical myths around that. And then, of course, the final bit is combined presentation. So for my sins, I have a 20-year-old child who's predominantly hyperactivity and impulsive, and my daughter who's inattentive.
So you truly get to see the full spectrum.
Yes.
And I guess you started off the chat saying that you had to really battle the system when your child started to show symptoms that you felt was needed to be I guess, medically diagnosed. Maybe you can talk us through what you've consider an appropriate pathway for someone who think they might have ADHD or think that their child might have ADHD.
Yeah.
What is the process?
So let's start with some don't do's. Do not rely on social media for diagnosis. In particular, TikTok, and it's great that people start talking about their ADHD diagnosis, but what I've found from our community, there's a lot of people who've gone in and said, that looks like me, I must have ADHD. You need to see a specialist and a trained professional. Then the second thing I would note for those who are parents, your school teacher, your principal has no ability to do any sort of medical diagnosis. And that's another issue in ADHD New Zealand that we come across. Well, my school says my child has. So in terms of getting a diagnosis, let's just keep it really simple to start with. Is see your GP, and then from there they'll refer you to a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And if you are seeing your GP as a child, they'll refer you to a pediatrician. And then happy days, you'll get a diagnosis or you'll get the support you need. So let's talk about the barriers. The first thing is a survey of our community says that only 23% of GPs understand what ADHD is. And I think this is the first barrier. So if you go to a GP and they don't understand ADHD, it is problematic. So it's something we experienced. We changed GPs with Matthew very early on, and it's one of the best things we did. The next thing is a psychologist and a psychiatrist who are able to diagnose, or a pediatrician if you're a child. In New Zealand, it is a chronic shortage publicly. There are parts of New Zealand that have no public support available, including areas of Canterbury. Actually, to be fair, most of the South Island. There's a little way of hope, that's Nelson. But I'm well aware in Canterbury, if you're an adult with ADHD, unless you have underlying serious mental health issues, your best bet would be to go to someone in Auckland or Australia. So there's a real shortage of specialists. Again, you can also get specialists that don't understand ADHD. Why do you need to see a trained professional? Obviously, it's medical, so you should see a medical professional. But the other aspect I would add is that ADHD, some of the symptoms could also be symptoms for other psychiatry issues, and it's important you see a specialist to work that through. Now, I don't think, as you would gather from my comment, that it's going to you're going to get much help publicly. So private is a good option in New Zealand, but there are still wait lists, 6 to 12 months, parts of New Zealand which aren't served that well. So it can be quite difficult to get a medical diagnosis.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate your point, just because you see online that you might have one or two traits doesn't necessarily mean you will have ADHD. There's often very strict criteria that you have to work through. And if you're an adult wondering if you have undiagnosed ADHD, a really critical component is actually, did you have these symptoms when you were a child? So not just because, you know, a lot of us after the pandemic sort of developed certain characteristics that might be influenced by the pandemic, but doesn't sort of speak about underlying neurodevelopmental disorders from childhood. So those are probably the two things to kind of really clarify. And as you mentioned that it's really hard to get support through the public system, and even privately you have to wait months. And so there's now increasingly, especially in America, these proliferation of like online companies where you can do a simple online test and then they prescribe you ADHD medication. What's your perspective on that?
Not good. So personal view, the future of medicine is going to be increasingly online. There are aspects to getting an ADHD diagnosis that a doctor or a specialist might want to know: weight, height, heart, blood pressure. So in my mind, I think a lot of that needs to be done in person. However, it is coming online more and more. Now, the reason I say it's not good, so I'm aware of some of the models in the UK and the United States. In a quick half-hour interview in an online quiz doesn't quite meet the standards for a diagnosis. I think in the future, as the science and the use of AI gets behind the questions and understands the questions and the sort of things they might be looking for, I think that will improve remarkably, but it's just something to be careful of. One of the other issues, as an aside, with ADHD is in New Zealand, there is no diagnostic guidelines set by the Ministry of Health. For a while there, if you went to their website, they last year that we found out that they were saying there are no diagnostic guidelines for ADHD New Zealand. So we're a community-based group. We're not a medical-based group. So we've corrected that. But there are diagnostic guidelines through it's the DSM, World Health Organization. And if you do get a diagnosis, you want to make sure that your specialist will be conforming to those. Now, if you see a psychiatrist or psychologist, they will be. Yeah.
Yeah. And obviously, want to sort of say that, Clearhead is an EAP provider, that if your employer uses us, you can sort of reach out to us for ADHD support. And for some employers, they are even willing to fund ADHD diagnosis as part of providing support to their employees. And these are usually can be up to a few $1,000s to do the assessments properly with one of our psychologists. And so, yes, something to keep in mind if you are trying down the public health route and really sort of banging your head against a brick wall. We do have availability, some even within weeks. So that's something to be mindful of. All right. So let's just say you went through the hurdle of it all. Happy days, you got diagnosed. What are common treatments that those with ADHD can utilize to get the support they need?
Yeah. So the most often treatment is medication. Let's talk about that for a second. So medication in New Zealand, which could be Ritalin or Concerta in the methamphetamine range, is run under a special authority. That means Pharmac give the doctor a special authority, and also means that every 2 years you have to go back and get it renewed. Now that, in our mind, ADHD New Zealand's mind, is a considerable barrier because, first of all, once you're diagnosed getting the medication, you should be able to get the medication that you need without having, we're aware of stigma from pharmacists. And then the second aspect is if you have ADHD, organising your life and making an appointment in 2 years to get it reconfirmed would seem daunting. Further, as I mentioned before, there's not enough specialist appointments, and you'd have to go back to psychiatrists and psychologists. So that's the way it exists right now for another 5 weeks in New Zealand. It's been like that for over 20 years, and all going well. And there was an announcement about a month ago. The special authority process has been removed for adults. Unclear on where that would be for children, which will remove much of the barriers for special authorities, or just go away, remove much of the barriers in access to medication. So that is a huge breakthrough for New Zealand. One thing I should mention, though, is medication is not necessarily the answer. We know from our own surveys that a third of those diagnosed are on medication, which means 2/3 of those diagnosed aren't. There are many things you can do: counselling, coaching, talking to nutritionists, exercise, and learning the skills you might need. So one of the myths with ADHD is I have ADHD, therefore I must take medication. It's not always the case.
There's, of course, concerns as well with, these sort of online companies that we spoke about before, where they make it super easy to get prescription to ADHD medication. Ultimately, these medication is a form of stimulant. They act quite similar, I guess, to drugs like cocaine. And so that's something that it's why it's important that there is some controlled access to it. But also we want to reduce as much barriers as possible. And medication is only one of many tools that will help support an individual.
One thing I will say, there is a new medication called Vyvanse, which is generations ahead of the likes of Concerta and Ritalin, and it doesn't have the stimulant type aspect to it. We got working with the government, got that into New Zealand about a year ago, and it's currently $100 to $120 a month. From the 1st of December, that will be removed. If I may estimate 10 to 12,000 New Zealanders on Ritalin or Concerta would be better off with that medication. Now, that is, before I say, before you all get excited and contact your GP, that is a specialist medication, so you'll need to talk to your specialist in the first instance.
Well, I guess before we go into what other supports there are available in the workplace that you've been able to pioneer some, maybe we could touch a little bit around this idea that often there is a genetic component to neurodiversity, like ADHD, like autism. And with your children having been diagnosed, did you actually review your own personal health conditions and stuff like that?
Yeah, the first clue, I'm smiling because my wife just burst into laughter. I well remember seeing a specialist of my son about the age of 8, and working through everything we needed to work through of MAD, and then the doctor looking at me directly, asking the question, so how old were you when you were diagnosed? And to which I was like, I haven't been diagnosed. And he's like, oh, well, this is awkward. We'll make another appointment. So that's how I got diagnosed in the autistic world. But I was very close. He said, you're an A, autism, ADHD. He said, you can choose. Now, what we know from our own research, when we asked the question of adults, what led you to suspect you had ADHD? I think it was 56% said my child got diagnosed. So it's often the way it happens. Increasingly, genetics have played, there's a lot of research. I was at an ADHD conference, which really showed in most instances there's a component of genetics. When it comes to genetics, we always look for the single answer. This person, my father has it, therefore. But the conference made a really good point. It's genetics. Of course, a person is made up of two people's genetics. Sometimes that combination creates the symptoms that they can see that can become ADHD. The one thing I did learn in the conference about genetics is there's not a single gene that leads to ADHD. It's a combination of several genes. But that's about as much as I want to say on that, because I want to go back to the disclaimer is I am not a scientist or a doctor. But it was a good, interesting conference.
Right. Look, one of the things that we do know for individuals who are undiagnosed, they tend to have very significant consequences that include, for example, having behaviors that end up leading them into jail and stuff like that. So it's very important that people do get timely diagnosis and appropriate support. So let's just say that you managed to get through all of that and you are getting some of the supports that you need to manage it, but you're struggling still a little bit in the workplace, and maybe there's a performance issue. Maybe it means that the way in which your workplace works doesn't quite fit the way that your brain likes to work, and it's causing some conflict. What is the best way to discuss with your employer or your manager that you do have ADHD and you need some extra support from the workplace?
It's a really good question. And the answer, it will depend on what sort of person you are and also what works for you and what type of job. The first thing I would say is communication. It's important to talk to your boss and your employer about ADHD and the sort of simple things that can help. About this time, recently talked at a conference. The question is, should I tell my employer I have ADHD? Our own research shows about 40% of people with ADHD do tell their employer. Our view is that you should. If they are a good employer, they will help you, and they will understand it. But it's up to you whether you're comfortable with that. The second question I thought you might be interested to know is it legal to discriminate against a person with ADHD? And it most definitely is not. And a recent employment court example highlighted that discrimination or dismissal because you have ADHD or ADHD symptoms is illegal. So that's great. So what is the sort of the practical tools? Where I work, you probably can't see it that well with the lens over it. So where I work, one thing I need is not so much silence. In fact, I like to work with loud music, but that's the way I find that turns off my brain and allows me to concentrate. So my work provides headphones. And that allows that to have the ability to work from home, but that also depends on what sort of job you are. In terms of tactile things, people with ADHD often have learning disabilities and the sort of things which might mean they're not so good with writing and spelling. So things like Grammarly or the advances in AI recently can be absolutely amazing with that. And then the final aspect to work that can worry a lot of people with ADHD is the social side. There's two ways here. Some people with ADHD can really have that hyperactive behavior, which can get us all into trouble. But again, talk about that with your boss and be aware of the cues. Or the second side, you could be very introverted and hide in the corner. And indeed, one person who I work with who has ADHD, the worst thing that might have happened to her last year was being made to go to a Christmas function because they find it very hard to communicate. So if your work understands this, then it's much, much easier.
That's really good. So let's just say that one of the employees was confident enough to share the fact that they have ADHD and they need extra support. And now you're on the other side. You're the manager that has that the employee has come to you. You don't have ADHD. You don't really understand what they're struggling with. What's the best way for you to support this individual? What's your role as a manager in the company?
I think the role of any leader is to get the best out of their employee. And I think it is really important that you understand what they need and understand how you can help. So the first thing I would say to any employers out there is don't go Google ADHD in the workplace. There's some the thing you need to do is find out about ADHD from organizations like Clearhead or ADHD.org.nz. Go to those websites and understand it. And then the second thing is have a practical conversation. Look at your people and culture practices and think about what messages and how you can get that across. And it could be practical solutions. Now, I was lucky enough to talk to the worldwide head of people and culture for Google a couple of years ago. And Google go out of their way to make people with ADHD feel welcome because that means that they get the creativity that comes with ADHD, and they felt that was a competitive edge. And I asked them, what is one of the things that you did? And there's this lady who had a PhD in rocket science, and I talked to her as well. And what Google did for her, she needed to move all the time. So, and when she was at the age of 26, she was the security leader for Asia Pacific for Google. So a really important job, but she needed to move all the time. So what they did, she was based in Sydney, is buy her unlimited ride the trains in Sydney, and then they gave her the ability to basically have a couple of seats, do her work on the trains, and then they set up cafes where she could go to, where she could charge her computer and have a break. Now, that is an extreme example, but the Google person I talked to is unapologetic, because she said Bonnie was smart enough to worth the investment, get amazing things out of her. So all we have to do is work out how we can get the best from her. And that's an attitude that I think we could all think about.
I think that's really great. I think regardless of whether you have ADHD or not, as a manager, if you work with those who report to you and understand how they like to work, how you can get the most out of them in a way that supports what they're passionate about, but also what the business needs, I think everyone wins from in that perspective. The example you kind of gave was almost quite tailored to an individual. Are there, I guess, systems that workplaces can implement for, that's organization wide rather than sort of a one-to-one approach?
Yeah, I think you need to think across the whole people and culture system. And it actually starts with recruitment, and you can have ADHD friendly recruitment processes, things like telling a person the questions ahead of time that you might ask them in an interview. When you're interviewing someone with ADHD, telling them that they're able to walk around the room if they want to move, and things like that, certainly making them feel welcome. And then in terms of the day-to-day, set really clear targets, but don't overwhelm a person. And I think back to my son, he is good one task at a time. So if you think a person is going to go write a giant paper and do this, this, and this, it actually might be easier to say, step 1, do this, step 2, do this, step 3, do this. And even get a person with ADHD to write it down. And then they can go through it like that. This way, a task doesn't overwhelm them. We've done some work with Massey University for their students, and it's the same principles. What they've done is set up a calculator, if you like. So I have a task due or an assignment due on this date, and they press a button, and then it sets the little goals that you can have to do to deliver that task, and then inputs it into Outlook. So I thought it was very clever. No doubt there are apps like that. So that's way you can work it through. Then the second thing is, when it comes to performance conversations, don't be scared to have an honest performance conversation. You should have the same expectations. The question I have is, do you have the understanding to help turn around in the case of poor performance? One more thing, don't sweat the small stuff. We all know there are people who turn up on time to meetings, and there are people who turn up who are always late to meetings. Doesn't matter, really.
Have you heard of like other systems like body doubling or ADHD specific planners or dopamine stacking? Have you heard of these things that people could kind of implement potentially in the workplace?
Yeah, I think probably what I have seen is the use of apps. So there are some really good ADHD apps, not so much in New Zealand, but in terms of that time management and things like that. Now, the body doubling, I've come across it once with someone with autism, actually. So body doubling, by the way, is a practice when a person with ADHD works on and completes potentially frustrating tasks with somebody else. And it's a really good way to call out the advantages, and I hate to use the word superpowers of ADHD, while also creating opportunity for somebody else to work together. And I've used it once in my career. It was a person who was pretty much the smartest person I've ever worked with. He had a PhD in applied physics from Oxford, and he was autistic and also non-communicative. He didn't like talking, and we hired him. So he was an absolutely genius. What I knew is I needed to have a very quiet space with him, but have someone who was the opposite to him, without sounding rude about this person. Not so much of a genius, but really good at communication. And if I could make these two work well together, it was limitless what they could achieve. And that's exactly what happened. So it's a really good tool. My question really in thought bubble is, in a workplace where everyone has strengths and weaknesses, why isn't that more of a practice? Because, I'm good at writing, I'm terrible at maths, so why not hook me up someone like that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think what we're kind of really saying again and again is what would benefit someone with ADHD and accommodating for them in the workplace is something that just any employee, regardless of whether
Yep.
they are neurodiverse or not,
Yep.
would also benefit. These are just ways in which we could support an individual in
Yep.
what is essentially a very fast pace and can be very overwhelming time to work.
Yeah.
I guess you can't really get support unless you ask for it.
Yep.
When would you suggest is the best time for people to kind of disclose that they have an ADHD diagnosis in the workplace? Is it before they got the job, or is it after the job?
So we definitely advocate as you get the job. Emails will be upfront and honest. And sometimes I get feedbacks like, if that's the case, I might miss out on the job because the employer might make a decision, I don't want a person with ADHD. My answer to that always is, well, you probably wouldn't want to work for that person anyway. So being upfront, it's illegal to discriminate. And so remember that. Now, of course, many adults these days, when they get the job, are not diagnosed. So they do get diagnosed. And I think, again, you should have that conversation with your employer, but be prepared for the answer of, I knew that. I thought you'd already been diagnosed, because people do start to go, I notice things. So I would tell them, your employer, as quick as possible. Now, waiting to a performance discussion, I don't think is a good idea, because they need to have a performance discussion, and then all of a sudden you go, well, you can't blame me. You can blame my ADHD. I've got ADHD. I'm not sure how that would go. One other thing, and another reason to talk about it, there are some jobs that, especially with heavy machinery, that might occasionally require drug testing in the workplace. Now, if you're on Concerta or Ritalin, it is potentially able to show up in a drug test, and that's why you should tell your employer.
Yeah, definitely, because it does sit in the same sort of controlled substance class.
Yeah.
All right. So having sort of thought about, the process of, what are the potential symptoms, the process to getting diagnosis, the process to getting sort of treatment, and then workplace support. For some individuals, I guess, they might be diagnosed a little bit later in life, and having to just process all of this can in some ways feel a sense of grief. They think about, if only they got an earlier diagnosis, like now they've got the diagnosis, or now that they started treatment, everything just seems so much easier, so much better. How do you help people work through that grief process?
It is a grief process. The way I occasionally talk to our community about this, and I've had it beautifully described as, this is my not guilty moment. And there's genuine anger and genuine emotion. So I think that my first piece of advice is, this might be something that's too big for you to handle yourself, and to seek some counseling and guidance. Join a support group and talk through it. ADHD New Zealand runs social media support groups, but there are a lot out there. Now, the reason it's so big, because you may feel that you've missed out. You may feel that you haven't been able to achieve to your huge potential that you have. And finding out such things, it can be highly emotive. Also, we know that the majority of adults diagnosed in our survey were originally misdiagnosed with a mental health issue such as depression. And they were diagnosed by a GP, who then gave them some pills and that. And about the proper counselling or the proper framework, and there can be anger about that as well. So depression is the common first misdiagnosis of ADHD, and it commonly happens from those medical professionals who don't understand the difference. I think it's a big thing, and it's too hard a journey to do by yourself.
Would you kind of say, I guess in processing part of this, and in some ways, often it even comes down to your identity, would you say that your pre-diagnosis self is different from the post-diagnosis self? How do you advise people to think about themselves in the context of treating their ADHD?
I think everyone's different, but I can tell you some of the common conversations I have. The first thing I see most often is, I'm going to fix it. Yay, I can fix it. And then I'll be normal. And so what is normal, first of all? And I'm not sure you can fix ADHD. You can reduce the impact of symptoms. You can really step into understanding it. This is not like a chest infection where you take some pills and it goes away. So there's actually a grief process in understanding that, especially if you've been relatively healthy, and the sickest you've been is a chest infection and you've got some antibiotics. So it is a journey. I've talked to people who have been diagnosed, got some counselling support, got some medication, and then a year later realised that they missed the excitement of the way their lives were. It's your life, so you can be who you want and take the approach and how you want. But certainly, I think being diagnosed as an adult is one of the most emotional times out there. And then I think the inclination of humans to fix anything. And look, it doesn't help when the term ADHD is such a bad term. So first of all, it's the first symptom, attention deficit, is actually not the main symptom of ADHD. Then hyperactivity, which precludes half the population who don't have that. And it's not a disorder. And I don't know who got away with naming ADHD in the world, probably American doctors. ADHD New Zealand prefer the te reo term, which is Aroreretini, sorry for the mispronunciation, which literally means attention goes to many things. I've always found it interesting there was a te reo term, because I found that other ethnicities really understand ADHD much better. They're more accepting of it. But it does vary, to be fair.
I think it's a nice segue to maybe transition to think about, obviously we talked about all the negativity that is associated with having ADHD. And yes, there's medication and support systems that you can use to manage the condition. But, are there, I guess, superpowers is one of the things that often get thrown around to look at this more positively. How would you kind of frame that?
Superpowers is a good way of thinking about it, though I'm aware that many of our community don't like that term because it puts pressure on them. But there are superpowers. Hyper focus in particular can be perfect if you're in the computer industry and you're a BA or something like that. My son is doing university. He could not study longer than half an hour. He's doing soil science. He loves it, but that's about as much as his attention span. And medication can help improve that, but that's as much as I can get out of him. However, he bought himself a special Lego set that took 6.5 hours to build, and he was focused. He just went for it. So that's really, really, really interesting. Statistically, those with ADHD are way more creative than those without, because they approach problems outside the square. Those of adults with ADHD in particular can be really, really good at problem solving, because they don't sort of accept the sort of assumptions of a business or the way we go through life. And so that high energy can be really awesome as someone who is a good leader. But what I've found from our community, the thing I love the most is they're very sort of warm-hearted. They're very nice. They're very compassionate. And in this world, I think that is a really awesome superpower to have.
I love all of that. It makes me feel, like I want to be friends with someone like that. And I guess along that lines, being different, whether you're a child in school or in the workplace, can be difficult in building friendship. And we talked a lot about almost like formal support that you can get, but we also know that ADHD or otherwise informal support from having friendship in the workplace makes a huge difference in someone's job satisfaction. What's your advice, I guess, in the context of someone who is neurodiverse wanting to be able to make good friendship in the workplace and I guess in the context of maybe, there might be bullying going on because you're different, how do you step through those thought process and the tips around what it means to make friends in the workplace?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And again, it's sort of an individual answers. One thing I really believe in is if you are someone with ADHD who is shy or not quite sure how to act, there are you can go to social skills. You can get assistance from counsellors that can really help with social skills to get those niceties. Picking on a sample of one, my son, if you were to ask Mac, "Hi, how are you?" he'll go, "Oh, I'm really good. How are you?" Now, he doesn't actually believe a single thing he says. He is in his head wondering why you're talking to me. But with some work we did with him to teach him those social skills has been really, really important for that. The second thing is those with ADHD often don't realize or recognize friendships that they're building, depending where they are on the continuum. And what I mean by that is take a second, take a breath. Actually, the person sitting next to you actually may be a friend, you've just not realized it. And the best way I think you can do things is start talking about common interests. It might be going for a walk at lunchtime. Hey, do you want to come for a walk? Or again, picking on my son who thinks he has no friends, but he does. But he goes and plays Dungeons and Dragons every weekend, and with the same guys that he's done for 4 or 5 years. And they all are autistic or ADHD, and they don't realize it, but they're doing things alongside each other and interacting with each other, and it's wonderful. So sometimes it's staring you in the face, but think about your social skills and think about how you can create opportunities to connect.
And obviously, there will be people who are listening who have done a really good job in pretending that they don't have the deficiencies that might that they have to, I guess, overcompensate for because they have other strengths that that others might not even see. So, what advice would you give for someone who's maybe still in the shadows about that they have ADHD?
They call it masking.
Yeah.
And it is a skill that those with ADHD have learnt their whole lives. And you learn to mask because you do something, you see the reaction, so right, I won't do that, or I'll do it this way because that's what people expect. And it becomes a habit. So if you, a personal view, if you do mask and it works for you, continue with it. But start to be aware of it. Start to know why you mask and what you can do with that. It's a way of fitting in, and there's sort of nothing wrong with that. You're just camouflaging your symptoms. But I think it's important to just understand why. Does hiding your symptoms help or harm you? I've seen research that goes both ways. So you get the feeling with ADHD is it's often the answer is it depends. But yeah, it's just something I think would be careful with.
What about that? We spoke about friendship.
Yep.
And the ability to, learn to socialize, skills to socialize. One of the other common symptoms is emotional regulation
Yep.
for those with ADHD. What advice do you have there?
You'd be aware yourself what is acceptable in the workplace or the home, and you'd be aware of the precursors to, I guess, poor behavior or emotional behavior. You might be getting angry, you might be getting frustrated, and you'd also be aware that if something were to go wrong, that it could have consequences. So my advice is really simple, is if you are going down a track where you're going to have an emotional outburst, remove yourself from the situation. Go for a walk, keep yourself safe and be safe. And I think people who have emotional regulatory side of ADHD is something they'll need help with in terms of managing, whether that's through medication, but counseling and getting a coach in that space is really important. And just to go back to masking, one of the downsides of masking is it could really start to build out and bring up the emotional side. You could be like suppressing it. And sometimes the world, we're human, right? Sometimes you need emotions. So suppressing it could have an adverse effect. ADHD masking is not managing ADHD. It's a really important point, and it can impact emotions as well.
And I think that it's really important to come back to what you said, which is there are all sorts of different ways in which one can cope with ADHD. That's not necessarily masking, and that's not necessarily just medication. I guess just as a quick fire, what's the top 5 things that people can do in addition to therapy, medication?
Coaching. So coaching is different from counseling. Coaching gives you practical tips, number 1. Number 2, exercise. I don't want to sound like your mother or your doctor, but exercise for the ADHD brain is amazing. One of the questions I get asked in the media is, why is there so much more ADHD in the world? And there's lots of reasons for that. It's a whole other question line. But one of the reasons, when I went to school, showing my age, and I went to a boys' school, there was compulsory PE at the start of the day, and at lunchtime you had to play a sport. So that was medicating, if you like. It has the same impact on the brain. Third thing, the practice mindfulness. Take the time to learn it. It is, I've been doing it for a year. It is hard because you're like, I'm being mindful, but why is my mind thinking about a soccer match? But take the time to turn your brain off. And there's some good music. If you type go into Spotify and you type ADHD music, there is actually music that does that. And use music. 4th tip, sleep. Don't forget to sleep. People with ADHD, especially as an impact of the medication, can have problems with sleeping. Talk to your doctor about that. Melatonin in New Zealand is widely available, though you do need a prescription and you do have to pay. You can also get good melatonin across the counter in chemists in Australia, and as long as you declare it, you can get that through. And then the final tip is please, please, please be kind to yourself. Life's not perfect. Nobody is perfect. So don't have high expectations of that you must be perfect. You are human. We're all human. And if you're kind to yourself and you can forgive yourself, it will be a much better outcome to move forward.
And I remember you said that you're part of another group called, is it Beehive, that helps with
yes.
coaching? Did you want to share that as well?
So partly founded So me and a colleague, we founded beehive.health. It's beehyve.health. And it's to answer the question, what else, if I was an ADHD adult, could I do as well instead of medication? So some of the things that we offer there is coaching. We also offer nutritionists. You can even get a physical plan, something like that. And it's just alternatives. And the insight that it happened because we were talking through lockdown, is that there's a whole stack of people out in New Zealand who, for whatever reasons, want to work part-time, or they have children, but they've got something to offer, versus a whole stack of New Zealanders who can't see or get into anyone, or alternatively are struggling just on the medication. There are many different alternatives to how you manage your mental health and your ADHD, and that's one thing that beehive.health wanted to do.
That's awesome. Yeah. And, you know, you've mentioned a couple of things, you know, in the context of supporting someone with emotional regulation. Mindfulness is one of them. But the way we like to think about it is, you know, really building that self-awareness, and something as simple as a mood tracker is a good way to help you figure out, you know, what are your triggers? You know, not everything will trigger you to have an emotional response. Having the time to regularly log your mood, there's a mood tracker app on Clearhead, allows you to be able to kind of go, every time X happens, that's when I really just get so angry. I don't know what to do with myself, you know, and being able to either learn how to manage situations or avoid those situations really will help with that emotional regulation piece.
I can't help but agree with that. It's nothing like I track my mood through my phone as part of me getting to understand myself. And it's nothing like your phone saying, and the days where you're not so happy are the days where you had 6-7 hours sleep. Perhaps you should try and sleep better and go to bed earlier. And I'm like, man, the phone understands me better than I do.
Yes. And often it's not rocket science. It's
correct.
Just the ability to be very disciplined around the basic habits like exercise, like sleep, like nutrition, that are all basic hygiene, regardless of whether you have ADHD or not, that will help you stay mentally well in this chaotic world that we live in.
Yeah, exactly.
And any final tips, I guess, in the context of, you know, maybe you're not a manager, but you're a colleague, a co-worker, around what to do to support someone that you haven't already spoken about?
Hey, I think as humans, compassion is very powerful. We all know when we sit next to somebody if they're having a bad day or a good day. So by all means, you should be compassionate towards them and tell the person you sit next to, sometimes you might just need a bit of compassion. There is nothing wrong with talking to a person about your ADHD, depending where you are in your journey. So for me, because we're in one of these modern offices where you have to sort of fight for a desk, one thing I do is say I need to have headphones on. That's really how I do my work. But I'm not being rude. I'd love to talk. Just let me know if you want to chat, and I won't be upset or anything. Or the other thing is, look, I just need to go outside. Hey, one other tip, walking meetings. If you're meeting with your boss and you're feeling a bit anxious, go outside, go for a walk.
Yeah, and it's it serves so many benefits, right? You get fresh air. Hopefully the sun is shining, so you get some vitamin D, which will help you sleep at night. And, you know, you get some physical exercise, and it also forces people to not sit and have long meetings, you know, and instead get to the point. So there's so many benefits to walking meetings if you can kind of suggest them.
Yeah.
That's awesome. We've covered a whirlwind of topics and tools and tips and techniques. Is there anything else that you feel has really worked for the ADHD community that you've learned that we haven't spoken about already?
So the ADHD New Zealand and its various communities have 40 to 45,000 people in it. So no, you're not alone. And we run 5 social media groups. Now, this might be a really bad way to say it, but no matter how bad your day is, it's really good to pop into a social media group and know that there's help, there's support, there's love, and that someone else may have had a worse day than you. And I get a lot of help from that. Now, so these groups through ADHD NZ are 24/7 and they're moderated. So if you know, it's very carefully moderated, and I just find that amazing that you can just connect. You're not alone. 280,000 New Zealanders statistically have ADHD. So you're most definitely not alone, though at times you may feel it.
I guess, there's the peer support element, and we also talked about trying to get support from, say, your managers or your people leaders. Most people wouldn't have that lived experience in the workplace. So where are areas of resources that you would recommend companies can go to train their managers or people leaders in supporting those with neurodiversity?
There's very few support training mechanisms at a workplace. However, ADHD NZ, doing a plug, has started doing workplace presentations, which looks at what is ADHD and how you as leaders can help your team. There's probably not enough in that space, but it is building. I'd imagine it'll be fairly common in the next couple of years. Overseas, it's huge. And if you were to use Google for that, you might find a workplace course online that you could pop into from New Zealand. Many of you also belong to wider professional body communities, and you'll find that many of them are starting to have that. Government departments used to be really strong at building that understanding, but it's not so strong now for all the reasons we won't talk about.
Yeah. And also at Clearhead, we have specialist consultants that basically are trained in supporting those with ADHD, and some of them have additional training to kind of look in the workplace perspective, what are the policies that can be put in place, etc. So if you need like a consultant to help your workplace to really put in place what's needed from an ADHD perspective, we can also support from that side of things. That sounds really good. And, and I think, not to sort of end it quite negatively, but, one of the things that I've definitely seen sort of as part of the discussion is that there are individuals who are currently either being performance managed out or have had experience where they've been fired from their job because of ADHD. I guess what's your one advice for individuals who are really going through a tough time right now with their workplace?
Hey, you have rights. And in most instances where conflict has come that I've heard about, the first thing is making sure the employer understands ADHD, but you do have rights. The ADHD legally is a disability in New Zealand, and that gives you all the disability rights that happened a few years ago. Now, those with ADHD often don't like to know that they have a disability, but unfortunately that label was required to ensure that the rights under human rights legislation was given its power in law. For example, sometimes if you had a child with ADHD, they'll be excluded, but actually once it became a disability, there's a whole different process they have to follow. So if it ever gets to that stage, try and avoid conflict, but do know that you do have rights.
That sounds good. And, we obviously spoke about how social media has its pros and its cons, and some of the support groups I think you mentioned was on Facebook. Are there other places to find support group that's not on Facebook?
And if you're on meetups, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch have face-to-face for professionals once a month. So if you're in Auckland, they meet at Paddington Bar, and they work things through like that. There's 500 people registered for that meetup, and about 20 people turn up each month. And I know also that's gone into other groups as well. if you want to know those details, just drop info@adhd.org.nz. Start a workplace one. Start it yourself, and use the resources around you as well.
I guess along those lines, what did you learn about starting that support group in FMG? What did you learn from having that support group in place?
Just don't have a structure, don't have an agenda. Just come along and be open and authentic and just have a conversation. It is really good. We had one this morning. And so, knowing I was coming here, I asked them what's the most important thing. We decided it was two things. One, knowing you're not alone. And then the second thing is just the freedom to explore and talk about things. Yeah, it's really good.
Safe spaces. Many safe spaces we can have.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Whether online, in person, outside of work, or inside of work. These are all places in which we can connect and be human together.
Yeah.
Well, that's been a super helpful chat, Darren. I think you've given us so many practical tips and tricks that people can think about to implement for themselves, for the people that they love, or in the workplaces that they work at. We like to end these conversations with one simple question. What is your one well-being practice, Darren?
Running.
Awesome.
I've taken to running over the last couple of years. Yeah.
Amazing. So good. So many benefits.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.